Okay, I think that if you want to understand the alt-right, the first thing you need to do is you need to understand how to look at variation in politics. And so for that you need to understand sort of that there exists a one-dimensional spectrum of from neurological liberals to neurological conservatives. And there are two brain structure differences between neurological liberals and neurological conservatives. The first is that N liberals have a bigger anterior cingulate cortex, and that N conservatives have a bigger right amygdala. I also recall reading something from a great website that has since paywalled their great content, Neuropolitics, that conservatives tend to be more quote unquote left-brained. That is, now in reality, almost everybody is left hemisphere dominant. It's just a matter of degree, and conservatives tend to be more left hemisphere dominant than quote unquote liberals. So telltale signs of someone being a neurological liberal is that they're less easily disgusted by things, by anything, by sexual acts or I don't know, gross things. They're more likely to try food that at first glance seems gross, and they're more likely to have messy rooms. Right? They also have a higher threshold for the blink response, i.e., they're less likely to blink in response to loud noises. They're more likely to avoid eye contact, to avert their gaze when someone's staring at them. And they're also more likely to be depressed, to have, and I mean clinical depression, and they're more likely to have vivid dreams. High IQ neurological liberals are basically TED Talks people. They like to explore all sorts of ideas. Two big examples I can think of what I think of as neurological liberals are Stefan Molyneux and Sam Harris. Steven Pinker would be one you would throw in there as well. Also, the usual suspects, people like Noam Chomsky. The most neurologically liberal people, I believe, are libertarians and objectivist type people. That is sort of ground zero of neurological liberalism. Democrats and quote-unquote progressives are the second most, or excuse me, white Democrats. I need to make this clear right at the beginning. And all this stuff, I'm talking about whites. We talk about other racial groups, sort of the spectrum, the political assignment based on where you are. I'm talking about white people here. I'll just leave it at that. Democrats and progressives are the second most neurologically liberal group, and conservatives are the least neurologically liberal among whites. Now, I bring up those examples because I want to make it clear that a neurological liberal doesn't necessarily mean a supporter of the Democrat Party or someone who believes in oppression narratives. And I have a theory as to why neurological liberalism is primarily a white thing, how it exploded onto the European population out of the North Sea zone, right, with Holland, Flanders, and southeastern England, and how these people are what ended feudalism. Right? And thus paving the way for a common market, which made mass production viable, which led to the Industrial Revolution. And these people are now, through their multiracial ideals, in the process of destroying Europe. And I have a big, long article talking about all the evidence of that. And the article is entitled "The European Revolution," where I talk about the war on murder, talk a little bit about the Hanau line, and then a little bit about the double replacement of the lower 2/3 of the population by the upper 1/3 socioeconomic status. Okay, white nationalism before the alt-right. So what then is the alt-right? Well, before talking about the alt-right, we need to talk about what is commonly referred to as white nationalism 1.0, or pre-internet white nationalism. Now, prior to 1945, there was no such thing as white nationalism, okay? As all European countries had white-only immigration policies, and any state in the U.S. or any European country with a substantial non-European population had all sorts of laws segregating the races and laws against intermarriage. This is also why trying to ascribe Nazi Germany or the Ku Klux Klans to white nationalism is quite silly. Ku Klux Klans plural, because there was no singular organization. Hitler was no more white nationalist than any other contemporary world leader. In fact, Nazi racial theories, Aryanism and Hyperboreanism, were condemned by the anthropological communities in Britain and the United States. In fact, they held conferences specifically to denounce the predominant racial thinking going on in Germany at the time. Okay? Nazi ideas were not common with white nationalism. And the clans did not become evil until later. The clans, the Ku Klux Klans, only became evil when the rest of society began to oppose segregation, but of course the clans continued to support it. All right, that's when the clans became evil. And that's when white nationalism, the term white nationalism, was born. Think about it like religious fundamentalism. Religious fundamentalism only became a relevant political force, or religious fundamentalism only became a meaningful term when it's not what literally everyone was. If you went to the United States in 1800, everybody would be, by modern day standards, a religious fundamentalist. And so campaigning as a Bible believer back then, nobody would do it because you'd say, well, I believe the Bible is the literal word of God. Well, so does the other guy. So religious fundamentalism didn't become a meaningful political bloc until it no longer held a monopoly, in which case it had to start to defend itself, and people started to identify their religious fundamentalism as something distinct about themselves compared to other people who were not. And thus it was something that they had to fight for and something they had to politically organize for. Okay? And that's what you saw happening with white nationalism. Until 1945, white nationalism had a monopoly. Okay, by 1965, it became reduced to a point where it was sort of a political bloc. That you had people, having to fight for it because it was no longer a monopoly. And by 1995, which is, in my opinion, the lowest point for white nationalism, it was at zero. But why? Why did white nationalism lose public support in the way that it did? Well, I can point to three things causing this decline to the low point in 1995. The first is the rise of the universities. The reasons for the increase in people going to college that's not something we need to talk about here. We can talk about how the GI Bill set it off, got a lot of people going to college, but then businesses, in response to so many people going to college, then started demanding people go to college, and it just became sort of a self-reinforcing cultural thing where businesses demanded people have college degrees and stuff. But we don't need to go into that here. Suffice it that we know that the proportion of the population going to college skyrocketed after World War II and continued to increase up to the present day. The second will be the rise of mass media. Okay, the rise of newspapers, which had been going on well before World War II, radio, which had been going on before World War II, and television, which came later. And of course, all the rise of mass media was going up and up and up prior to World War II, and of course it continued after World War II. But this rise of mass media was a necessary component into what I'm going to explain later, how the decline in white nationalism came about. And the third factor was, of course, Hitler, right? Because Hitler had racial theories, right? He had beliefs in racial purity, and people would say, and we saw what that led to. It led to the Holocaust and the gas chambers of Dachau and the killing machines of Bergen-Belsen and all that stuff. So the fact that Hitler's racial theories were totally different from those prevalent in the United States and the British Empire was kind of a point of nuance that was never conveyed to the public. Okay, Hitler had racial theories, and so therefore racial theories are now. So remember, the centralization of mass media means that things can be misrepresented in this way, right? They can say that, oh, look, here's what Hitler thought about the master race, Aryanism, and all this stuff. Therefore, if you think there's genetic differences between whites and blacks, that's Hitler, okay? Because Hitler said things about human groups, you're saying things about human groups not being the same. Hitler. Okay, so it's a very crude sort of impressionistic connection, but when you control everything, or at least you have enough control of media and university and people of sort of a like mind, for whatever reason, controlling these institutions, that's the effect that you have. And that's another thing. How did people who have a like mind come to predominate mass media and come to predominate the universities? That's another topic for another time. We don't need to sort of explain how that happened. We just sort of have to recognize that it happened. And from that, we can, because we're talking about the rise of the alt-right. This is what this is about. So we don't have to, what's important is that this happened. It's not necessarily important to explain why people with certain views came to predominate universities and the mass media. Okay, so we know how the university and legacy media works. Narrative is generated in university social science departments. That's important because university has all sorts of history to it and sort of the trappings of authority. And so people, it's like the modern inculcation of the old church, that the peasantry would sort of imagine that the priesthood behind closed doors had access to a kind of knowledge that the mere mortal, the layman, could never fathom. And of course, I explained in other articles that the university today is literally a continuation of the cathedral schools and monastery schools. That there was never actually at any one point a hard break when the cathedral and monastery schools stopped being cathedral and monastery schools and became universities. That was just a slow change that took place over hundreds of years between 1200 and the 1800s, right? So that's where narrative is generated, and that's where it has a special ability to be generated because basically university social science is a giant confidence trick. Right? A lot of people will have more confidence in narrative generated. They'll have more confidence in narrative if its source is university social science departments than if it's from somewhere else. And that's why the rise of university and relevant to what we're talking about, the rise of university social science departments was so important. So that's where the narrative is generated. This narrative is then relayed by legacy media or mass media, and this narrative is then amplified through movies, through TV shows, and quote-unquote news coverage. Important to understand what is news. What is news is whatever mass media decides to cover. Right? That's news. If they don't cover it, it's not news. Right? You need to understand it. So they can pick and choose what is, where they say what is news. They say look at this, look at this, look at this, look at this. They don't have to say don't look at this or this. They just don't show you. Okay, and before the internet, if all your quote-unquote news came from mass media organs, which were all controlled by people who think a certain way, right? What is quote-unquote news, right? The stuff that you heard was the news, could be directed in towards the way those people think. And the results of this were absolutely devastating. And so ideas that we would recognize as white nationalists went from being, such an overwhelming default that they weren't even an issue, to being an embattled issue, to then being so marginalized that they were no longer really an issue, right, prior to in the mid to late 90s. However, even at the absolute lowest point for white nationalism, which was probably in the mid 1990s, or just before the internet became popular, there was a hard core that would remain white nationalists despite total information control. Okay, television, newspaper, radio, all preaching the same sort of anti-white message, right? Sean Hannity speaking of that interracial marriage was an American sacrament, right? So, but in this environment, what kind of person would have been a white nationalist between, say, 1975 and 1995? Well, I believe there was a documentary entitled Blood in the Face, where they went to these sort of Aryan Nations meetups during this time period. And your default reaction to this should be, oh, the cameraman, they're just going out there and finding the dumbest bubbas that they can possibly find and putting a camera in front of their faces, letting them talk, and then playing back and then editing in the dumbest stuff that they got. Right? That's what you would what your reaction should be. You should be highly skeptical of the documentary Blood in the Face. You should be. However, I think it's an accurate portrayal of those kinds of people. Right, and I think it is an accurate portrayal that these people are, on the whole, crazies. Right? Because imagine if the only information you had came from your professor, from TV, or from radio. How the hell could you ever come to a white nationalist viewpoint if these are the only ideas that were ever put into your head? And of course, the ideas being that white racial identity is an inherently evil thing. Hitler, right? Because Hitler is now white national. Even though all the countries that fought against Hitler were in modern terms white nationalists as well, only Hitler is ascribed to white nationalism, and so World War II gets sort of transmuted into, into a war against white identity, and so history sort of gets converged into that. The answer, of course, is that if you're like most people, you couldn't become a white nationalist in that kind of controlled media environment, which is why very few people did. When you think about white nationalism before the internet, the only way you could spread the message is through flyers, mail campaigns, phone calls, or signs and marching in public. Maybe you got on a talk show radio thing every once in a while. Maybe you even managed to have a local AM radio station where you were allowed to sort of seep in white nationalist points here and there. Okay, but the only people who would ever find such a message are the kinds of people who were actively looking for it in the first place. Okay, and that they were actively looking for it in the first place, even in the kind of extremely centralized media environment that existed in the 1990s. So, you can call these people the vanguard if you want, or you can call them the loony bin, or you can call them a mixture of both. But these are very not neurotypical people who would make up what we now call white nationalism 1.0. That's what that is. So, the alt-right. And I want to go back to the neurological liberal, neurological conservative thing I was talking about. Basically, white nationalism 1.0 was all over here on this chart, while the alt-right is white nationalism across a broader band of the spectrum. And this thing called the alt-right, this is just a result of the internet. Because look, white nationalism is what whites do, and we know that they do because they did. White nationalism is what whites do in the absence of a mass media and a school system that relentlessly attacks whites and pushes oppression narratives and demonizes white racial feeling. And the internet is actually a reversion to the kind of decentralized sort of folk politics that existed prior to mass media. It's like going back to politics being discussed in small towns, or when the people with large audiences just happen to be sort of specific entertaining guys, right? I'm not talking about what's best or what establishes truth for now. I'm just talking about what happens, right? And in that kind of quote-unquote natural environment, white nationalism wins. And the YouTube political scene is sort of an emulation of this folk politics. It's not quite the same because you've got the Google censors running around, okay, shutting down channels that are too effective. And of course, everyone on YouTube has been massively processed by the schools and entertainment media before they even get onto YouTube. So it's not quite the same. And the result of these people coming into YouTube being heavily processed before even getting there, the result of this is that the kind of quote-unquote based people, they'll argue against like oppression narratives, right, which they've come to pejoratively label the regressive left or social justice warriors, but they're still conditioned to keep away from, the demonic, all right, i.e. full-on white nationalism. But when you reduce the power of the controlled media, right, pushing the university social science narratives, right, the narratives that originate from university social science, amplified by mass media, the result, when you remove that stuff, the result is going to be white nationalism or a trend towards that. And so the rise of the internet and the diminution of mass media to control narrative has seen a increase in white nationalism and proto-white nationalism. And just think of it this way. Compare Emmett Till to Trayvon Martin. Right? Back when Emmett Till was killed, there were no camera phones and there was no internet. And so mass media could say whatever they wanted about the Emmett Till case. And there was no way to check or question the official story. You could not check any of it. And so mass media, they could do a steamroll narrative of a white bigot killing a poor black didn't do nothing. When they tried to do the same thing with Trayvon Martin as they did with Emmett Till in the age of the internet, it didn't work, right? Because there's phones everywhere and there's internet, and right, and of course the internet and quote unquote the alternative media was able to sort of was able to sort of jam that narrative. And that's the alt-right. The alt-right is proto-white nationalism, okay? Stefan Molyneux, I think, is an example of someone who was a proto-white nationalist becoming a white nationalist. I think Stefan Molyneux is at this point a white nationalist in all but name. To put it another way, there's this thing that I call the anti-white narrative. You can call it different things. You can call it, social justice. You can call it the social justice version of history. You can call it there's all sorts of names. But when I say the anti-white narrative, people know what I mean, right? It's basically an intersection of things about colonialism, slavery, segregation, and modern day white privilege. And of course, biological differences between groups cannot explain differences between groups. And in fact, those biological explanations of group differences have in fact been incorporated into this anti-white narrative, right? So in terms of, and they call it scientific racism. Okay, and so not only are there no biological differences between groups, but if you see someone saying such a thing, that is then used to trigger prior conditioning against quote-unquote scientific racism. So it's very meshed, right? That's it. It's like all these things mesh and reinforce each other in a very resilient way, in a very anti-fragile way. So there's this anti-white narrative, and different people have imbibed different degrees of anti-white narrative, with the fullest expression of anti-white narrative today being white privilege. And it's that, white people we all know what white privilege is. Forget that. Okay, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. This video is already going on a bit long. So white people, before the existence of this anti-white narrative, they were all white nationalists. Okay, they were all what we today call white nationalists. They stopped being white nationalists because of the anti-white narrative that came about from university. That's where the narrative was crafted, and it had to be crafted in some place like a university in order for it to have, the trappings of authority, right? They needed something like a university in order to pull off the confidence trick, and then mass media relays the narrative that comes from the university. So that's what stopped white people from being white nationalists. And there are these people on the internet who argue against this narrative in various ways. But what's interesting about it is that they're arguing against the narrative that caused whites to stop being white nationalists, but they do not then become white nationalists themselves. And that's what's sort of that's the alt. That should be a good definition of the alt-right, okay? Which is, and they're proto-white nationalists in that and that white people, sort of in a quote unquote state of nature, are all white nationalists. It's not even something that is debated. It's not something that they really even try to do. It's just what they are, right? It's just it's a default, right? And it was always the default. But then you had these ideas, this anti-white narrative that came in and caused, through massive environmental effects, caused whites to become not white nationalists and in fact hostile to it. But now with the age of the internet, this narrative has been jammed quite a bit for a lot of people. And so they then stop believing the ideas that caused their parents and them to be hostile to white nationalism. So it's like the reasons that they were against white nationalism in the first place have all been detonated, but they're still not white nationalists. Right? And I think that's a good definition of the alt-right. And the alt-right, of course, is just that, except they then are just straight up white nationalists, and that's all it is. Now, one thing a lot of people will talk about is they'll talk about how this term alt-right is dishonest because it's basically just white nationalism, and that's they have a point in saying that, okay, but the reason that there is a term alt-right, and the reason that alt-right is conceptually divided from white nationalism 1.0 is because it's different kinds of people, okay? Because white nationalism 1.0 is a certain kind of person, a certain kind of neurotype that had existed, since the mid 1970s, when white nationalism was really marginalized as a political force. Okay, and so those kinds of people are different from the kinds of people who will embrace white nationalism today from the internet. Right, that is the kind of people who would not embrace white nationalism in the mid 1990s, but will today because they have access to the internet. That's the alt-right. And it's an important conceptual distinction, even if at the end of the day both groups are white nationalists. It's like there is real circumstantial significance to separating these two groups from each other. Okay, because these are two different kinds of people, and they came about for historically different reasons. All right, so it's important to distinguish the two. Okay. Right-wing SJW. And there's a term that a lot of people use. It's called right-wing SJW. The alt-right, they're just right-wing SJWs. And it's kind of like when they say that, like when somebody who is a quote-unquote rationalist or a skeptic uses the term right-wing SJW, they're actually revealing a lot more about themselves when they use that term. And I'll explain. Like when I was younger, I'm going to tell you a story about myself, but it's going to be relevant. Okay. When I was younger, I was a big Christian, and I really believed that book. Okay, that every word of the Bible was the inspired word of God, translated by men as best they could translate the inspired word of God. And so I read the book of Revelations. Right, I scoured Revelations because I wanted to see the signs in the book of Revelations. Yes, the Gospels, that's all good. They tell you how to live your lives. We know how to live our lives from the Gospels. But Revelations is a potential peek into the future. And if we could decode Revelations, and if we could see the signs, we could prepare for the second coming and the rapture. Moreover, on any matter of government, what better foundation for government than the inspired word of God? And so I was going around supporting government that would most closely match the will of God as best we can glean from Scripture. Okay? And so I was saying all this stuff. But there were all these people around me, and it was weird. Like, they go to church, right? They say they're Christians, but they're not so interested in what I have to say. They're not so interested in figuring out the signs from the book of Revelations, and they're not so interested in trying to mold government in a way that is biblical. And I was confused by all of this. And it made me wonder, what did these Sunday Christians really believe? Because they sure weren't acting like they believed this book, right? I believed it. I was like, this shit, this is real, this is true, let's do it. Let's do this. But these Sunday Christians, they were content to sort of almost walk around in a daze. It's like, do they believe this? Do they really believe? I mean, what's going on here? And I was kind of the same way with racial inequality, okay? Because listen, assholes, listen. There are these gaps between the races, gaps in income, gaps in health, gaps in wealth, gaps in going to prison, okay? There are all these gaps. Why are there these gaps? The political equivalent of Sunday Christians, the sort of white conservatives, Merca Motard, flag and dirt kind of people, they don't really feel the need to answer these questions, right? They can say that they believe in genetic racial equality, walk around saying that I think everyone's born the same, okay, but that, and that blacks and Hispanics, but they're not put upon, there's no racism here, and they're also no less hardworking than whites, okay, so, but then of course what they've done is they've basically removed all potential explanations for all these racial gaps, but these gaps are still there, right? So you talk to white conservatives, they'll say, no, racial genetic differences, not allowed. Differences in how hardworking they are, that's not, they're just as hardworking as us whites, okay? Well, are they discriminated against? No, America doesn't discriminate anymore. So they've removed, so they have no way to explain gaps that obviously exist, right? But what's so maddening about it is all these white conservatives, they're perfectly content to walk around with these contradictory beliefs, right? Or at least these beliefs that obviously do not explain reality, without actually having to resolve the problem. Okay, but of course I did have to resolve the problem. Okay. That's just how I am. There are these gaps, okay, and there are two serious narratives to explaining these gaps, okay, and it's really a true dichotomy. It's not, you can't really pick and choose between the two, and I'll explain why. Okay, and of course the two serious narratives explaining the gaps are genetic differences, and the other is the oppression narrative. And while theoretically you could believe in some mixture of both, in reality, you'd have to be kind of retarded to believe it's some mixture of both. Because these aren't just a grab bag of isolated propositions, right? The oppression narrative and the genetic narrative, right? They each have their own mesh of arguments. They each connect to each other. And they reinforce each other in a system, right? It's not so much it is a system of arguments, okay? And if you're taking ideas sort of a la carte from each narrative, the genetic narrative and the oppression narrative, if you're taking arguments from each narrative sort of a la carte, what that means is that you don't understand either narrative at all, okay? Because they are so interconnected, and you can't. They don't fit with each other, okay? These aren't so much explanations as explanatory systems. And, look, there are some variations between people within each system, right? They're not all exactly the same. Like, individuals are not exactly carbon copies of each other. There are variations. There are disagreements between racial hereditarians. There are disagreements between believers in white privilege on like specific things. But a good analogy for this, it would be like car engines. Okay, so you can have different car engines with different size parts, with V6 versus V8 stuff like that. But still, it's either going to be a gasoline engine or an electric engine. And you can't just swap out parts between each engine's willy-nilly. Okay, unless of course you're just an idiot whose car was never meant to run in the first place, in which case, you can just stick the battery plug into the gas tank and say, vroom, vroom, I think for myself. Okay, that's what, like, the centrists, quote unquote, on this stuff do. That's basically what, like, conservatives who talk about, like, family value, that's basically what they're doing. They're basically taking the plug of an electric motor and putting it into a gas tank and think they're so nuanced, think they're not, hidebound to dogmatically march in lockstep with one system or another, that they're thinking for themselves, when really they're just too stupid to understand how what they're doing means that they don't understand either argument at all. Okay. And a funny result of this is that you end up being a bit totalitarian. Okay. If you've bought into one of these explanatory systems, unless, of course, you sort of realize the dynamic, unless you realize that these are totalistic explanatory systems. And what it'll do for a lot of people, it'll make you highly resistance to change, because you cannot be persuaded piecemeal. Like, if you're a believer in white privilege and total environmentality of group differences, you cannot be persuaded piecemeal on anything, because as soon as someone argues against you on one thing, 10 other arguments start coming in and saying, well, you made some points here that sounded okay, but I know this has to be true because there are 10 other things connected to this one thing that you appear to have debunked. But it can't truly have been debunked because there's these 10 other things that depend on it. Right? And so the system reinforces itself, which is why when dealing with these things, it's all or nothing. Okay? Like, there's no, there's no moderating, right? It's either all in place, or like it's either all in place or it shatters. Okay? So but the thing is, like, there's even more similarities between what is called the alt-right and SJWs. Like, both the alt-right and SJWs understand that free speech, free markets, standardized law, and meritocracy are white ideas. And so when people go around promoting these ideas, right, but then they say, I'm not a white nationalist, well, they're either stupid or they're dishonest. And I know that's a pretty deep cut. That's a pretty deep pill to swallow. But guess what? That is something that both the alt-right and SJWs say. That, if you're a libertarian, but you're, like, against white nationalism, then you're an idiot. Okay? Now, both, and that's just sort of a reality. Now, the SJWs, they have a narrative. They explain this by saying that these ideas, right, free speech, free markets, standardized law, meritocracy, these are luxury ideas that whites can afford to have because they aren't currently oppressed and they are not currently in need of restitution, which is why only whites in the majority support small government, and why only whites oppose hate speech laws and hate crime laws and oppose affirmative action. Okay? And they will argue that supporting small government and opposing affirmative action, that these are connected beliefs. They are connected via whiteness. Okay, there's an intersectionality between these beliefs and whiteness, right? They intersect. SJWs, they have a whole, and so there's a whole theory, and like they all mesh into each other. Okay, it's a system. And here's another example. Okay, free speech. Like, what is free speech about today? When people talk about free speech, like, there's sort of ideas and high-minded, lofty thinking. But look, in practice today, what does free speech mean? Let's drop the false suspense here. Free speech today is about white nationalism. Okay? Maybe in some countries it's about Holocaust denial or something, but really, when we're talking about free speech, we're talking about white nationalism, all right? Because nobody's censoring anarchists, nobody's censoring libertarians, nobody's censoring even religious nuts, okay? it's all, and nobody's even censoring Kangs or black nationalists, right? It's all about white nationalism, right? Or if there's some other group that's being censored, like those, like, pedophiles are being censored or something, like, that doesn't matter because pedophilia has no potential as a mass movement, whereas white nationalism does have potential as a mass movement, right? We know that prior to 1945, basically the whole country was white nationalist, right? So white nationalist has a potential for, dominance in a way that, being in the way that NAMBLA doesn't, right? So like, get real here. When we're talking about free speech, people can say, whether or not you choose to let a supporter of NAMBLA have a platform on your YouTube channel is a largely irrelevant thing, right? Because he's not going to persuade it. Or say you let a flat Earth believer have a platform on your YouTube channel, like, nobody cares. Or Bigfoot or whatever. Like, nobody fucking cares. Okay, that's not. You can say, oh, I'm supporting free speech or something. Yeah, whatever. Like, none of that matters. No one's going to be persuaded by that. That has no potential for mass movement, status. Just come off it. When right, white nationalism free speech substantively means white nationalism. Now, to have free speech, right? So that's the first thing. Free speech means white nationalism in practice. Okay. That's point one. Point two, to have free speech in a substantive way, the speech needs to be platformed. It needs to have an audience. People need to listen to it. Okay? This is why the media environment of the 1980s had the same effect as totalitarian censorship. In fact, it may have been even more effective because they didn't incur the odium of having to formally censor people. They could still say, oh, you have your free speech. Now, we control all the newspapers. We control all the radio stations. We control all the TV. Right? And there's no internet. But you are free to go out you are free to hand out flyers, so long as your neighborhood, so long as it's legal to hand out flyers where you are. You're free. So yeah, they could hide behind, the constitutionally protected quote unquote free speech, but it didn't really matter because they had control. So in a substantive sense, there was no free speech, and they didn't have the odium of formal censorship. Okay? But now that there's the internet, white nationalists have both the formal free speech protection of the Constitution plus a platform that they never had before. Now, there are people who will come on and say, this is something that Lowbergs, or what I call libertarians, what Lowbergs like to do, is they say, I don't have any obligation to give you a platform. For free speech, I am merely required to not stick a gun in your face and tell you to shut up or else I'll shoot you. In fact, by free market principles, I can fire you for saying things I don't like, or boycott you for saying things I don't like. That's the free market, buddy. Right. So people who say this, they're talking about. These are people who have a very trivial, a very nominal conception of free speech that doesn't actually manifest in the real world. Okay, and amazingly, what I found was or maybe not so amazingly, ContraPoints actually seems to understand this. ContraPoints understands that free speech, to mean anything, it has to be platformed, right? And it has to be somewhat protected from physical action against people saying the wrong thing, right? Because everyone around says, all right, well, you're going to be fired, and nobody's going to give you a job, and no one's going to do business with you, and you'll basically live outside the town and starve and die if you say the wrong thing. But you're allowed to do that because we're not going to chop off your head if you say the wrong thing. We'll just ice you out of everything, and you'll die as an isolated human being in a state of nature, right? but see, like that's right, and see that's a very trivial, very nominal conception of free speech that doesn't actually do anything. So that's point two, right? Substantive free speech has to be platformed. Right. Point one, real free speech in the world today means white nationalism. Point two, substantive free speech has to be platformed. And finally, There's point number 3 is that the purpose of free speech, the whole point of free speech is you lose, right? The purpose of free speech is that is for there to be a pathway, a realistic pathway for the heterodox ideas, that is the challenger ideas, to win, and for the incumbent ideas to lose. There has to be a pathway for minds to be changed, okay? So for real substantive free speech, right? Like that's the whole point of free speech. The point of free speech is to change minds and then to change some sort of policy, change a law, change a business practice, right? Change how people interact on an individualistic basis, right? Or on an interpersonal basis, okay? That's the point. The point is to have those real world impacts, and there needs to be a real pathway to having those real world impacts. If you satisfy the other conditions, like it's platformed, okay, and the speech that is allowed is in fact the relevant heterodox ideas of the day, which today it's all white nationalism. That's all it is today, okay? Everything else is just a little shit show on the side, okay? It's all about white nationalism today. In the Soviet Union, the relevant free speech would be anti-communism and pro-market economy, okay? Like if you were in the Soviet Union in the 1960s, okay, and they're talking about free speech, and what if somebody came up to you and said, well, I'm for free speech for everything except capitalism and except proponents of market economies? Right. Do you see how stupid that is? Do you see how hollow your free speech? Like in the Soviet Union, that's all free speech means. That's all free. That is the only relevant form of free speech is supporting free markets and capitalism in the Soviet Union. That's the only way in which free speech means anything, because that is because the bugaboo is anti-markets and anti-capitalism. Okay, so the only meaning I belabored that point enough. So those are the 3 things that have to be met for free speech to really mean anything in the real world. Like you have to deal with the relevant heterodox idea. Okay, in the Soviet Union that would have been, allowing free marketers to speak. Today in the United States that means letting white nationalists speak. Okay, so that's criteria. That's point 1. Point 2 is that it's got to be platformed. If it's not platformed, it might as well not exist. Okay. Point 3, there has to be a realistic pathway for the changing of minds. If there is no realistic pathway for the changing of minds, who the fuck cares? All right. So that's the point of free speech. Now, SJWs, on some level, they kind of understand this. All right. They understand that substantive free speech means giving a platform, having a pathway to changing position and policy. All right. And they also understand that free speech today means white nationalism and basically nothing else. That's the only major thing being censored, right? And so free speech substantively today means giving a platform and seriously opening your minds to white nationalism and basically nothing else. Okay? That's a hard fucking pill for them to swallow. Now, they then come out and say that they are against free speech. Okay? Which makes sense. They are against free speech. Now, Sargon, of course, he'll respond to these SJWs, and he'll say, "Tut tut, you totalitarian SJW, you should be like me and support free speech." But of course, Sargon does not support free speech in any meaningful way. Okay, Sargon only supports a very trivial and very nominal form of free speech that in practice is no different from what the SJWs are doing. Okay, so really all that's happening is Sargon is too stupid to realize that he's actually against free speech in any substantive way. Right? That's all this is. And here's another thing. In terms of understanding Islam, one thing that the alt-right, quote unquote, and that SJWs understand is that Islam, drum roll please, Islam is a race. Now, you can pretend to be retarded, okay, and utter the trivial truth that Islam is not a race, but a religion, and therefore Islamophobia isn't racist. Okay, you can, and you can play your game of of conceptual tiddlywinks if you want to do that, okay? But look, in reality, like we all know what's going on. White people are conditioned to think that quote-unquote racism is evil. But since they're humans, right, white people are humans, they want to be racist. Islamophobia is a way of being racist without actually quote-unquote being racist, because they'll say, well, Islam isn't a race, it's just a religion, right? And so that's what's happening here. And of course this ties into the retarded autistic counter that the rationalists will throw out, which is Uncle Tom's. For example, they'll say, well, I'm okay with blacks as long as they're conservatives, right? I mean, it's retarded, right? It's kind of like saying, I'm okay with blacks. I don't really care for blacks except for those blacks which hate other blacks, right? So that's what happens when a conservative says, well, I don't really like blacks, or they'll say something, well, I'm not against people being black. There's plenty of conservative blacks that I like. Well, of course, 90% of blacks are not conservative, and those conservative blacks more or less hate other blacks, okay? So it's kind of like saying, it's kind of like Germany invades France, and there's a German who says, well, I don't hate all Frenchmen, right? The Frenchmen that collaborate with us and promote German domination over the French lands and promote the replacement of the French language with German, I like those Frenchmen. Therefore, I am not anti-French, right? It's retarded, okay? That's sort of what's happening when people who say, well, I'm not anti-Arab, I'm just anti-Islam. If you're an Arab but you're not Muslim, right? That's just stupid, because Islam is a kind of racial fealty to the Arab, right? Now, also to other groups, when you have Muslims in Europe, okay, it's to become a Muslim is a form of professing racial loyalty or racial fealty to the biological grouping of people that tend to be Muslim. Okay, that's what that means. So to a rationalist or a skeptic person, he'll look at Berkeley, what Berkeley does, as being hypocritical, because Berkeley, they allowed Richard Dawkins to speak there when he was attacking Christians, but then they deplatformed Dawkins when he attacked Muslims, right? And the rationalists and skeptics will look at this and say, oh, that's hypocritical on Berkeley's part. But it's not hypocritical at all. Christianity, right, not the new pseudo-Christian crap that's running around, but real Christianity that actually comes from reading the Bible. Okay, it's called fundamentalism, but which is a retarded term, because what else would Christianity be than the fundamentals of the Bible? Of course, it's I don't know what non-fundamentalist Christianity is even supposed to be. Other than heresy, right? It's just retarded. Anyway, but the thing is, Christianity, real Christianity, okay, it's implicitly white, or we could say it intersects with whiteness. Right? Now, attacking white, this is SJW thinking, attacking whites is okay because they're privileged. Right? The existence of any kind of racial economic inequality is ipso facto evidence of white privilege, because biological explanations are not allowed. SJWs, they battle this privilege. Therefore, attacking Islam, which is brown, okay, is not, is oppressive, right? If you are attacking Islam, you're engaging in oppression because you're quote unquote punching down. Because these are the disadvantaged groups, right? Brown people are disadvantaged. That's what they believe. They really believe that shit, okay? But attacking Christianity, that's punching up. That's fighting against the oppressors and the privileged people, right? And so that's sort of it's a retarded framework that they're doing to sort of explain these things. But what they're doing is not hypocritical within that framework. Okay, so in summation, the alt-right is the return of white nationalism that white people always gravitate to in folk political settings, right? That is non-mass media. And the rise of the alt-right, and the alt-right is just proto-white nationalism. It's basically people who were anti-white nationalists and held the anti-white narrative. Then that anti-white narrative got scooped away, but for whatever reason, they don't then become white nationalists. So it seems like maybe there's a little bit of lingering narrative or lingering social cues telling them to not do that, right? But that's all the alt-right is. And so the alt-right and the alt-right are part of the exact same phenomenon. Okay, and so when the ADL, when they put the alt-right and alt-right on the same page, I don't know if they necessarily understand it as well as I think I do, but they understand this at some level, that these things are part of the same phenomenon. That Mike Cernovich and Mike Enoch are part of the same phenomenon, right? It is part of the pulling back of the anti-white narrative and the reconstruction of white nationalism across the rest of the neurological spectrum. White nationalism 1.0 was sort of the hardcore that would never go away in sort of an extreme corner of white neurology. The alt-right is sort of the reconstruction of white nationalist ideas across the rest of the neurological spectrum. And as a result, what's going to happen is that you're going to see much more normal sounding, normal seeming people holding white nationalist views. And so it'll be sort of trippy for a lot of people because they're conditioned and they're used to sort of the white nationalists of the mid-1990s, when the only people who had white nationalist views were, I have to say it, were a little bit abnormal, okay? And so when you have a whole bunch of people who are not so abnormal, right, who then become persuaded of white nationalism because of the internet, they're going to get weirded out. Okay, and that's sort of the alt-right. What happened is that prior to World War II, everyone was a white nationalist. Then the university media complex, using Hitler, created the anti-white narrative, which became popular, and then this resulted in white nationalism shrinking until only a very hardcore remained. This hardcore remnant, white nationalism, is known in alt-right circles as white nationalism 1.0. The behaviors and characteristics of this hardcore remnant are then used to dissuade any would-be white nationalist by associating the idea of a white country with the particular individuals that composed white nationalism 1.0, right? It's a kind of social status attack. And this is why Zuckerberg is very much opposed to anonymity on the internet, because anonymity reduces the effectiveness of these kinds of social status attacks. And in practice, when we're talking about social status attacks against an ideology, we're talking about white nationalism and basically nothing else, right? So when Zuckerberg is talking about anonymity leading to bad behavior, he's talking about white nationalism, right? He's not talking about anything else. He's not. Please, just stop. Okay, stop with. It's all about white nationalism. And the alt-right is just white people going back to white nationalism across a broader band of the cognitive political spectrum. The alt-right is the reconstruction of white nationalism across the entire neurological political spectrum, made possible by the internet to the degree that the internet emulates sort of a pre-mass media state of folk politics that always and eventually produces nationalism in white people. Okay. But, and I'll say this for the person who looks at who looks at the rise of the alt-right with dread, who looks at, because look, I'll tell you, I know, like, back in 2007, 2008, I was talking about, like, race realism, and I'll tell you, it is palpably different now than it was then. Like, I can go into groups and say these things, and, depending on who I'm talking to, I don't get shouted down. Or the kinds of arguments will be, well, let's say you're true, what does this mean in practice? Or things like that. They'll sort of argue at the next level. But that did not happen in 2007, 2008. Back then, right, the very idea of biological differences between groups of people, between groups of people that correspond to races, that was just shouted down, right? That was, reported, flagged, and banned. I made videos just on race and IQ, just classic hereditarian stuff that was like, straight out of the bell curve. And those videos got flagged down for hate speech. Those kinds of videos don't get flagged down for hate speech anymore. Now you have frickin' Stefan Molyneux getting 100,000 views a video saying that stuff that I was saying and getting banned for. Okay, it is a totally different environment than it was 8 or 9 years ago. So for the person who looks at these events with dread, look, white nationalism is what white people do in the absence of any kind of controlled media. Okay? We know this because white people were white nationalists in a time prior to any controlled mass media, or at least far less of an impact. Prior to 1945, basically everyone was a white nationalist. The control of the university mass media organ complex and the control that was going to have on shaping thought, that was never going to last forever. It's lasted for a really long time. It lasted for an impressive and depressingly long time, okay? It was never going to last forever. And the diminution of the effects of that, the diminution of the effects of that kind of control, and the ability to push the anti-white narrative, the diminution of that's all the alt-right is. Right? It's a return to the default political views that white people have, which is white nationalism. That's all the alt-right is, and the alt-light is sort of a lower level symptom of that.